qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem.
This morning our presentation and discussion is about St. Francis de Sales, in large measure about his life, not so much about his philosophy and what he taught, but I do have some references on some of his major writings that I would like to go over with you. So if we could please begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful. Kindle in us the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and we shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. So St. Francis de Sales was born in Thorens-Glières in the Duchy of Savoy on August 21st in 1567 to François de Sales de Boisy and Françoise de Sinaz. François and Françoise were from an old Savoyard, which is in the southeastern section of France, which abuts the Piedmont region of Italy, okay, and not far from Austria, right in the middle of the Alps to an aristocratic families. He's the eldest of the 6 sons of the de Sales family, and he was educated to become a magistrate within the region of Savoy to represent the de Sales family. He enjoyed, as you might expect, a privileged education at La Roche-sur-Foron until the age of 8. And we can find La Roche-sur-Foron located to the north and east, so a little bit closer to Austria in Italy in the Savoy region. At 8, he transferred to the Capuchin College at Annecy, which is located in Lake Annecy to the south and west. So Thorens-Glières is here, La Roche-sur-Foron is here, where am I here? And Annecy is down south and west on a major lake in the Alps region there. It's rather apparent that St. Francis spent a great deal of time away from his family in his early years achieving his education. In 1583, at the age of 16, under obedience to his father, he transferred to the Collège de Clermont, a Jesuit school in Paris, to study rhetoric and the humanities. And as a nobleman in Paris, he was attended by a servant and a personal priest. He undertook, in addition to his college courses, lessons in the gentlemanly pursuits, such as riding, dancing, fencing, conversation, those things that he would need to interact with the aristocratic society within which he would be living. At the time, he's described as an intelligent and handsome, tall, well-built, blue-gray eyes, though reserved and quiet, but gracious to be around. Francis was always a welcome guest in the homes of the nobility in Paris, with whom his parents had relationships. In 1584, Francis undergoes a conversion. He's attending a theological discussion about predestination. And from this discussion, he gathers that he is damned to hell. He suffers a major crisis of despair from that time through December in 1586. In January in 1587, he visits the parish church of Saint-Étienne-des-Grès in Paris, where he prayed the Memorare before a statue of Our Lady of Deliverance, a black Madonna. There, he dedicates himself to the Blessed Virgin Mary with vows of chastity. Francis, in addition, becomes a tertiary of the Minim order. They're a suborder of the Franciscans who are even more ascetical than the basic Franciscans. That is, they were very much into denial suffering, penitence, and all those sort of behaviors to tame the spirit. And Francis concludes from this episode that in spite of the fact of his debaseness, of his debauchery, that God has good in store for him, in large measure as the first epistle of St. John teaches. That is, God is love. Hence comes St. Francis's foundational spirituality, the way of divine love. He will later promote that way, that idea, that base spirituality in all of his writings, but most particularly in his seminal work, The Introduction to the Devout Life. At this point, Francis continues his education in Paris, and in 1588, he completes his education at College de Clermont. He then enrolls in the University of Padua in Italy to study law and theology. Law for daddy, theology for himself. He takes Father Antonio Casavino, a Jesuit, as his spiritual director, and with Father Anthony discerns his call to the priesthood. In 1592, Francis receives his doctorate in law and theology. Francis, at this time, after receiving his doctorates, makes a pilgrimage to Loreto, Italy, presumably in thanksgiving for a successful completion of his studies, and probably of equal importance to prepare for his homecoming, because it was not going to be as pleasant as he might hope. So in 1592, Francis returns to Thorens-Glières, to the home of Francois and Françoise, and he has a path laid out for his life, but so does Francois. Francois had his life planned that he was going to be admitted to the bar, he was to be appointed a senator, he was to be married, and all of this was arranged. And as you might deduce, he rejected that plan of his father, and it gets so testy that it requires the intervention of the Bishop of Geneva, Claude de Granier, to allay the efforts of Francois. Bishop de Granier has Francis appointed provost of the Diocese of Geneva, and provost at this time was the highest office in a diocese, immediately below the bishop. So eventually Francois, Francis's father, relents. Francis signs over the rights of family succession, and Francis is allowed to be ordained to the priesthood. He's ordained in 1593 and is appointed, as arranged, to that post of provost in Geneva. But he engages in evangelistic efforts in Le Chablais, a Calvinist region of Geneva, Switzerland, because if a very brief overview, at this time, Calvin and Calvinistic teachings has taken root in Switzerland and Austria, and those countries have become very Calvinistic, rooted to the point of actually persecuting Catholics in the region. And so here comes Francis in literal battle with the Calvinists in the region. So he engages them, so much so that many attempts on his life were made, that he had to be protected by the Duke of Savoy's garrison on a regular basis. Literally, his life was attempts on his life were made a number of times. But his persuasive demeanor, his gentlemanly attitude, his ability to proclaim the love of God in such a clear, gentle, and well-grounded way allows him to convert key Calvinists, to bring them back to the fullness of the faith in the Catholic Church. And so, over a long period of time, over some 15 years, he proclaims the gospel in this area around Geneva, in Le Chablais, to bring rather the Calvinists back to the fullness of the faith. In fact, at the request of Pope Clement VIII, he's asked to meet with Theodore Beza, the patriarch of the Reformation in Austria and Switzerland. And Beza is shaken in his Calvinistic faith, but history shows he was unwilling to transition back to the church. Francis's base in this Le Chablais region was in Thonon, and he would travel in the area and always return back to his home base. And by the end of 1598, a large part of the inhabitants, as I mentioned, had returned to the Catholic faith. In 1599, Bishop de Granier requests that Francis be appointed as coadjutor bishop. Pope Clement VIII summons Francis to Rome for a personal interview to ensure that he indeed is worthy, as it were, of being appointed as coadjutor and as bishop. Pope Clement is recorded to have said this: "Drink, my son, from your cistern and from your living wellspring. May your waters issue forth, and may they become public fountains where the world may quench its thirst." Historically, and should you choose to read his writings, you would see that your thirst will indeed be quenched by the love of God, by the love rich, the insightful writings, the writings that call to the soul in a sweet and refreshing way of St. Francis. His writings and evangelical efforts would see the fruit of this prophecy. In 1601, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Henry IV in Paris. He meets Cardinal Berulle there, the chaplain of King Henry IV. He's invited to give the Lenten sermons at Chapelle Royale, and in spite of Henry's reputation for a court with very bad morals, Francis's preaching is well received by the court. Henry was reputed to say, quote, "A rare bird, this Monsieur de Genève. He is devout, also learned, and not only devout and learned, but at the same time a gentleman. A very rare combination." For a time, Francis becomes Madame Acari's confessor. Madame Acari is the foundress of the nuns of the Discalced Carmelite order in France, and he consulted with her as to how to incorporate St. Teresa's of Avila's rule into the Carmelite order in France, and becomes a spiritual director for a period of time for Madame Acari. In 1602, upon the death of Bishop de Granier, Francis is appointed the Bishop of Geneva, and he immediately institutes some reforms for his diocese. He requires catechetical training for young and old alike. The pervasive finding of the post-Reformation Church was that catechesis was really not being done in a systematic way. And many of the reformers in this time, including St. Francis, institute very, not rigid, but systematic methods of teaching people the faith. That is, applying the catechism and bringing people to a fullness of understanding of who it is we are as Catholics and what it is we believe. In addition, Francis goes through and makes very prudent regulations for the clergy. Part of Martin Luther's beef with the church was the inordinate behavior of the clergy at the time of the Reformation. And again, St. Francis moderates that behavior, that the clergy is to serve the people, the servant of God. they are. Francis visits every single parish within his diocese. He reforms religious communities. Arguably, he brings them into compliance with the rule with which they were founded. He expresses his love for the poor in meaningful ways by dressing plainly, eating simply, and running the bishop's household with the greatest economy. Translated, he gave away as much as he could to the poor and did not live the high style again as many of the religious communities, priests, and bishops had been living at the time. And finally, Francis celebrates the sacraments freely, particularly those of hearing, particularly hearing confessions and preaching with a great verve and vigor. Francis, in addition to all of these things, writes innumerable letters of spiritual direction. He would deliver Lenten and Advent retreats in Dijon in 1604, where he meets a Baroness de Chantal, in Chambry in 1606, in Grenoble in 1616, 17, and 18, and in Paris on his last stay in 1618 through 1619. In fact, in November of 1618 through September of 1619, the last period of extended time he spends in Paris, he's compelled by parishioners to preach daily sermons, to fulfill the requirements, as it were, of the people who thronged to hear his holy and apostolic sermons. In 1610, he founds with Baroness de Chantal, who we know as Saint Jane de Chantal, in Annecy, the Institute of the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And this institute was founded for young girls and widows who were called to the religious life, but who could not, could not endure the corporal austerities of the other religious orders who were prominent at the time, i.e. the Carmelites, the Franciscans, the Benedictines. While in Paris, he befriends another well-known saint, Vincent de Paul, and acts as a counselor, confidant with St. Vincent. In 1622, he's required to accompany the court of Savoy into France, and at Lyon, he insists on occupying a small, poorly finished room in the gardener's house during that court visit of the Visitation Convent in that area. And on December 27th, he was seized with apoplexy, received the last sacrament, and he dies on December 28th in 1622. St. Francis is buried on January 24th in 1623 in the monastery of the Visitation in Annecy, which he founded with St. Jane. And St. Jane, incidentally, is also buried there. However, St. Francis's heart was left in Lyon, as the residents of Lyon did not want to give up their saint's remains, a fairly common practice at the time. During the French Revolution, however, his heart was transferred to Venice, where it is currently stored and venerated today. So let's look at some of St. Francis's principal works. He wrote Controversies, and these are the multiple leaflets that he wrote during his time in Le Chablais from 1583 to 1599 to refute the teachings of the Calvinists during that evangelical effort. In total, when read systematically, they form a complete proof of the Catholic faith. He also wrote Defense of the Standard of the Cross, a demonstration of the true cross, an explanation of the crucifix, a clear explanation of the sign of the cross, and an explanation of why we venerate the cross. His seminal work an introduction to the devout life. He intends to lead us to Philo, Thea. Philo, lover. Thea, God. He intends us to lead us to be a lover of God. And so in it, he leads us to the idea that the first order of work is to conquer sin. And that in so doing, all are able to live pious lives. And in so doing, all are called to be united to and with God. And that is accomplished by practicing the evangelical virtues with an increased zeal as we grow in the holiness of life, so that not only do we grow holy, but those we encounter grow holy. And finally, we're taught how to reform and then persevere through the trials of life, which will surely and inevitably come. Another writing of St. Francis' treatise on the love of God. It's a 12-book treatise. Books 1 through 4 deal with the history and the theory of divine love. The process, that is, that divine love takes in finding and winning over the human heart. He explains how God's action and acts and desires us far more than we could ever possibly desire God. Book 5 explains the love of complacency, and in this sense, complacently means resting in the love of God. In other words, being relaxed in the presence of God, in the overwhelming, unbounded, unguarded, total embrace of God. And his love of benevolence, that is, his desire to give to us all that is required, all that is needed and all that is wanted for us to become the creature that we are in God's image. Books 6 and 7 speak to the affect of love. That is, the affect, the relationship between God and man. The relationship that God desires to develop between us, he and I. And by consequence, the affect of love that God desires for you and I to have for each other. Books 8 and 9 speak to effective love. So, when God acts on our heart, something happens. What is that something that happens? St. Francis describes it and encourages us to see it and to embrace it and to then implement it in our lives. Books 10 through 12 speak to applying the lessons contained within the preceding 9 books. The next work is Spiritual Conferences, and they're really conversations, as it were, or letters of spiritual direction that Francis wrote to his many spiritual directees, and in particular the Sisters of the Visitation. And these letters were made possible, or made rather available to the publisher of this for that purpose. There are sermons that have been recorded, and there are 2 groups of sermons. The ones that he wrote, that he handwrote himself before his consecration as bishop, and those that have been synopsized after his consecration. And so there are, again, sermons that have been provided to us from St. Francis. And finally, there are books of letters. There is a book of letters that incorporates some of the letters he wrote to the directees other than the Sisters of Visitation. His spiritual life. Let's look at that for a moment. When St. Francis would talk about the spiritual life, there were 2 primary elements that he would bring forth. First, as you might expect, he would flag that struggle against our lower and fallen nature, the human nature, the unregenerate human nature. And secondly, he would speak to the struggle that exists within us to unite our wills to God's will. He would encounter people and acknowledge that both are true, that we all are in the action of encountering our degenerate nature, yet we all who seek to know God and submit ourselves to his will are striving and struggling to unite our will to God's. And Francis would remind us that there are two methods to accomplish this. One is penance, and one is love. He would flag that penance is not to be neglected, but in particular, penance is to be completed from the motive of love. The senses are to be mortified through mortification of the will, the mind, and the heart. Such mortification is ceaseless. Such mortification is to be done in full view of our brokenness. Such will is to be done with abandonment to God. Such a mortification will be filled with successes and failures. It doesn't necessarily, Francis would teach, include physical abuse. It doesn't necessarily include physical privations and deprivations, but it was based in the heart, the mind, and the will. And so, why Francis was castigated by many of his peers at the time, because he would preach contrary to the ascetical nature of many of the orders of his time. But Francis would always tell us to remember we need to keep God in full view, in, through, and with Jesus Christ. Let's look then at some of Francis's veneration and patronage. Francis was beatified in 1661 by Pope Alexander VII, who also canonized him in 1665, a fairly short period of time between his death and canonization. St. Francis was declared a doctor of the Church in 1877. Now, we've heard the title Doctor of the Church. I'm not sure if you are aware of what it means, but let me put forth what I found in the Catechism. It says that it's a title given since the Middle Ages to certain saints whose writings or preaching is outstanding for guiding the faithful in all periods of the Church's history. St. Francis's teachings, by that definition then, are timeless and also timely for us right now. Pope Pius XI declared St. Francis patron of writers and journalists. St. Francis is also the patron of the deaf. And there are a large number of dioceses, universities, and seminaries, parishes, and religious institutes who fall under St. Francis's spiritual care. So what could be some takeaways? Well, first is whenever we encounter stories of great things done for others, or in the case of St. Francis, we see the saints responding responsibly in the best way they can, we see some common elements, and those elements are they're watching, they're listening, they ponder, but not too long, because then they act. A fairly popular priest of recent history, Father Benedict Rochelle, used to say that it's the next best step. Take the next best step. So watch, listen, ponder, but respond and take the next best step. Francis did that in his life. Another thing we see in St. Francis's life is, in the midst of his action, is continual conversion. He changed direction from living only for his wealthy pleasure to serve and not be served. But he does not disparage wealth. He does not disparage anyone. Rather, he encounters people where they are and he calls them to conversion. As God called him to daily and deeper conversion in the way of divine love, so too St. Francis reminds us that we are called daily to conversion, to turn back to the Lord, to turn back to the fullness of faith, to turn back to God's love, his unbounded, unfathomable love that he is pouring out upon us on a daily basis. The third thing, we see that St. Francis additionally received a specific call for a particular time, for a particular place, and a particular mission. Responding to what he heard, saying yes to submitting his will to God's will, he then received the necessary graces to effect the change that God wanted in his environs at that time, at that moment in history. But yet the church tells us, because of the greatness of God's love and the richness of that message is timeless for us today too. So the call is particular in time and place, but can transcend that moment and be for all times. And so, the question remains, like St. Francis, am I ready to respond to what I hear and see in the world? Am I ready to receive God's grace for me this day and be converted? Are you?
Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi,